Good morning and welcome back to another family video studies through the Gospel of John. I know it's been about 2 weeks, took a week of vacation, and last week computer fried and had to wait for a new computer, so it's been a little bit, but I want to jump right back in. I kind of want to give us a little bit of a reminder. We are in the Gospel of John, and the Gospel of John is written so that you may believe, and that's, once again, we're going to be talking about that over and over and over again. And so one of the things we've been trying to do is take these sections of Scripture and try to put them in that context, all right? See how they fit, how they flow. John is not concerned with just giving you random details of Jesus' life. Luke, and that's okay. Some Gospels are, I'm just trying to give you an orderly account of what happened. There is an order, and it's a chronological order in that case. And, it's just a lot of... I don't want to say mundane because nothing that Jesus did was mundane, but sometimes there's information about where he went and what he did that isn't in the sense of a theological significance. And when I say theological, in the study of Jesus, sometimes he just said or did something. And once again, I want to be very careful by saying that. But John leaves no room for any of his words to really just kind of be, this was just added information to give you a better sense of what was going on. John picks and chooses his accounts and his words, I believe, pretty carefully, and to give us an overall picture of Jesus as the Messiah and Jesus the Son of God. Once again, I don't want you to think for a moment that other Gospels don't do that. Matthew has some of that. Mark has some of that. Luke most certainly has some of that. And nothing that is written is mundane about Jesus. But once again, I hope you understood what I meant. So this morning we're just going to look at the first 15 verses last time. And if you go to our YouTube page and Facebook page, you will find the link to the overall. I kind of did an outline of the entire book. Now we're just going to look at the first 15 verses because there's a lot here and there's a lot I want to discuss. And I'm going to read it first and then we can jump right in, okay? So I'm going to read from the New American Standard Version. And it says, "After these things there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethsaida, having 5 porticos. In these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered, waiting for the moving of the waters, or the stirring of the waters. For an angel of the Lord went down at a certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after stirring up of the water, stepped in was made well from whatever disease which he was afflicted. A man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been a long time in that condition, he said to him, 'Do you wish to get well?' The sick man answered him, 'Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me.' Jesus said to him, 'Get up, pick up your pallet, and walk.' Immediately the man became well, picked up his pallet, and began to walk. Now it was the Sabbath on that day. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, 'It is the Sabbath, and it is not permissible for you to carry your pallet.' But he answered them, 'He who made me well was the one who said to me, Pick up your pallet and walk.' They asked him, 'Who is the man who said to you, Pick up your pallet and walk?' But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. After Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, 'Behold, you have become well. Do not sin any more, so that nothing worse happens to you.' The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well." And so we're going to kind of stop there for a moment. That's as far as I want to get in this morning's, today's lesson. And so we're going to look at the crime, right? We outlined it last week, and this is the section entitled "The Crime," meaning what is it that Jesus is doing here? This is the actual events that caused Jesus to be under interrogation and such. So we look at this. The man is healed. The man is interrogated. Once again, we're going to outline the section. Jesus is identified as the criminal. That's kind of where we ended. And that's going to end this section that we're going to talk about today. All right, so first thing I want to talk about is this magical healing angelic pool, okay? Such places, as up on the screen, such places were not uncommon, okay? So there are a lot of sites, holy sites, there are a lot of healing sites that are identified as places of healing, and there's a lot of superstition involved in them. Some of them still even are around today. People have, if they can just find where Jesus was baptized, right? They can go, and that water has remained holy because the Son of God was baptized there. They go down into this river and they believe that God's giving them blessings just because they're contacting a place or stepping on a place or standing on a place that Jesus once stood. And so in especially Greek and Roman cultures, this was very familiar. A lot of their temples and a lot of their shrines and a lot of their altars were said to have magical healing abilities or blessing abilities. Or if you went and did a certain act, you went up on this mountain. And, if you know anything about Greek mythology, there's 3 women with 1 eyeball. If you do a certain, and depending on the myth that you're reading, you do a certain thing for them or a certain, they'll tell you about your future. And so, this isn't unique. But what I do want to discuss is the fact, well, we'll get there in a second. But once a place, and so here's kind of some facts. Once a place was identified as a place of healing, the tradition was almost impossible to stop. What I mean by that is you could literally, once the tradition is started, it was almost no way to stop it. There was somebody who was going to believe it. There were people who were going to believe it. There were people who were going to go out and do it. Okay. And so there were many of these places in, ancient traditions. And so this is a place where Jesus is coming to, and this is where a place where this man is laying. It is a tradition that if you go down into this pool, when the waters are stirred, that there would be a healing. And actually, excavations at the site show that even after New Testament times, the pool continued to be used as an Asclepion. It's a Greek healing sanctuary, okay? And so they built sanctuaries around it or altars around it. They would have priests to it, all these kind of things. And so excavations show that this, even after this time, this specific location continued to be, a place of a sanctuary. At St. Anne's Church, if you go into Jerusalem today, this well still stands. They will actually take you down into this well where they believe it is. And, they have built things around it. So why is it in the text, though? One thing we need to understand is about translations, okay? And so the difference between translating something or the difference between inspiration and translations are 2 different things. And I have at the bottom there, just because something is inspired to be in the text does not mean the actual statement is true. So we have a lot of statements from like Nebuchadnezzar, who believed, when he went up on top of the mountain and he said, all these things I have obtained for myself, I have, that is inspired to be in there, but the statement itself was false. And it comes to be false because, Daniel's like, hey, God allowed you to be in this position. God is the one who established this kingdom. You did not. It was an inspired text, meaning God wanted it in there that Nebuchadnezzar said this, but was not inspired in the sense that it was true. Okay? So there's the difference, meaning that Nebuchadnezzar was making a true statement. And so the same thing is here, but this is a little bit different. You see, many translations in John chapter 5, starting at the end of verse 3 and all the way down to verse 4, the New American Standard has early manuscripts do not contain the remainder of 3 nor verse 4. Some translations, like the NIV, have it out completely, which is particularly fine. I don't believe it is a part of the translation, okay? One of the things that a lot of scribes would do, they would make scribal notes to help explain a passage about cultural, political, or religious significance, okay? And so when you're reading this, and if you're not from this era and you don't know anything about this pool of Bethesda, the scribe who translated this is trying to help us to understand this is what people believed about the pool that would happen. And once again, whether it is inspired to be in there or it is just a scribal note, the same practical application can be taken from this is the fact that we have no reason to believe, okay, that this pool, an angel went down and stirred the waters, and actual miracles and healings were happening and going on, okay? The fact this person had laid there for 38 years and never really went in, even though he's going to make an excuse later, is part of the fact that this probably wasn't happening. There was some superstition around it, kind of like in today's modern day miracles and modern day healings. There's a lot of superstition involved that people like to get involved in. But anyway, my point is is most manuscripts leave out this section. It's not found in a lot of manuscripts. And if you understand what manuscripts are, we have close to 4,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, and most of them do not have this section of Scripture in it. So when they're looking at the actual Greek, this section is missing. Some do. That's why we believe it to be a scribal note. Okay? So I think it was just put in there to help explain what the stirring of the waters is, because if we did not have that section, it would be a little confusing for those who did not know the history behind this pool. So, man is laying here by this pool, said to have magical healing abilities. He'd been lame for 38 years, who had been ill for 30 years. We don't know he's been laying there for 38 years, okay? Don't make assumptions in the text. Just try to go with what it says. But he was lying here now. How long he's been lying here? Who knows? But Jesus is going to approach him, okay? So now we're going to look at the man being healed. Now, the man is ill for 38 years, okay? But John indicates here, rather than like in John chapter 9, verse 1, a man who is blind from birth, John indicates that he lost his ability to walk at some time, okay? So he had been lame. He was there. He had a man who was there who had been ill for 38 years. And normally if he had been ill from birth, and ill just means a sickness or some kind of, and it's going to be a lameness, which we're going to see is a paraplegic. He can't walk. That something happened in his life to cause this, okay? And that's going to be further substantiated later as we're going to talk about that later. But he would come to this pool, and it was a place that he could beg, okay? And so there's a lot of assumptions that can be made. Jesus approaches him, which is, the next section here. Jesus approaches him. And Jesus does this often, by the way. Jesus, like the Samaritan woman, approaches the Samaritan woman. Give me water. Sometimes Jesus approaches, like a Nicodemus, comes to Nicodemus. But Jesus does most of the time, Jesus is approaching a crowd, or he sees them like sheep without a shepherd, and so he goes to them. Okay, so Jesus is very much an approachable person, and I think that's extremely important in Christianity. That yes, there are times we have to wait for people to bring up the discussion, right? But there are times we need to go to people, and Jesus always goes to someone who's hurting. He always goes to someone who's in some kind of need, or there's something in his life that Jesus can fill. And, I think that's an awesome way to reach people with the gospel. I think it's an awesome way to teach people about Jesus, is, as Flavel Yeakley used to say, to find a hurt and to heal it. And it's not always a spiritual hurt. Sometimes a person, maybe down on his luck, maybe a person who's needing some financial help, maybe someone who's needing some spiritual advice, or some counseling or some food or whatever it may be, some clothing, and you help them and you use that as an opportunity to teach Jesus. Here's the thing, you can't just teach Jesus through the good act alone, okay? A lot of people have this idea, well, I do good, and I'm just waiting for somebody to ask me why I do good. But there are a lot of people who do good outside of being a Christian, and we live in a pretty good world. I'm not, we sometimes beat up on our culture, beat up on our world, but we live in a world where I have seen people, someone who's hurting or someone who's in need. I've seen someone who I didn't know from Adam, right? You know what, I'll help you. I'll do that. Oh man, you're missing $5 in line. Here's $5. So those kinds of things happen all the time. And it's not unique to Christians, okay? It's not unique. We're not the only people who do it. Now, there are certain things that I think Christians do that go above and beyond the normalcy of helping somebody. Like, man, what, and those things really shock and awe somebody. But we need to approach people. We need to not be so uncomfortable. A man who's been ill for 38 years, laying down, a paraplegic, probably, wasn't the most best dressed, probably smelled funny. There's probably a lot going on here, okay? How long he's been laying here? When's the last time he's had a shower, a bath? Those kind of things. Nobody will pick him up in the pool. Who's picked him up to bring him home? So he was laying here. It's a place he could beg, and it seems to be a place where, he was basically, his needs were provided for at the minimal level. People would throw food or throw some money, he wasn't starving, obviously. He didn't starve to death. Doesn't mean he was eating well either. So, do you want to be made well? This could indicate a lack of willingness on the part of the man, which could be verified by his response. Verse 7, Sir, I have no man to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I'm coming, another steps down before me. So, that could be an excuse. Oh, nobody's put me in. Well, have you asked? Jesus seems to know something about the person that he asked the question, do you want to be made well? And that's the thing, there has to be a want. And, I know a lot of friends who are preachers or Christians who get very discouraged, when they're studying with somebody, talking to somebody about Jesus, talking to somebody about their faith, that they just don't want to listen, they don't want to hear it. And there has to be a want to factor, okay? You have to create a need and a desire for a person. They need to see that they need Jesus, that they need Christianity. And it's not just because, hey, you're a sinner, you're going to hell. That doesn't work only because people have heard it so often that it's almost like a scare tactic now. And people see through scare tactics, okay? It's like a lot of the superstition stuff or a lot of, conspiracy theory stuff. Hey, man, the world's coming to an end, dude. If you don't come on, man, get a break. Give me a break. So we got to create real needs in real people's lives, that go beyond just, you're a sinner and you're going to hell, because that may not scare some people because they don't believe it yet. You have to give them an opportunity to believe. So, I think this gives us a lot of information, and it tells us about who Jesus is as the Son of God. Jesus left heaven to come down to man. And this chapter is proving that Jesus did not come for men to flock to him, but him to go to men. Okay? And, the Bible seems to indicate that our sin keeps us from wanting to draw close to God. And Jesus then had to draw close to us and attracted us to him. And so, this is just kind of one of those, I think it's extremely significant. Now, this first 15 verses, I don't believe are the crux. Oh, 1 second. The crux of this lesson. Okay? I believe it is setting up the stage, but there's a lot that we can learn here. Okay, so Jesus, this is cool, but Jesus ignores. Look at verse 8. Sir, I have no one to come pick me up when the water's stirred. So he even brings up the superstition. Jesus ignores the man's excuse and his superstition about the pool and just gives a command. He ignores the excuse, get up and walk. And the Greek is literally get yourself up and start walking. I mean, it is a command. It is an imperative command. It is get yourself up. If you want to be made well, you need to have the want. And this goes back to the question, do you want to be made well? Get yourself up. And I think Jesus creates a desire there. And the man stands and he walks. Okay, so which I think is very, just very neat. He picked up his pallet and he began to walk. Now we get into the importance in this story, the turning point, okay, in this story. What has Jesus done that's so wrong so far? Because normally when Jesus, we know it's a Sabbath. We're going to find out here in a minute. Normally, when Jesus does something on the Sabbath, a miracle on the Sabbath, they're coming at him for the miracle. Well, nobody's seeing this. Jesus is not doing this one on display like he has in other cases. But Jesus obviously knows the results. This man's going to pick up his pallet and he's going to begin to walk. So let's talk about that for a moment. So the Sabbath. Let's read in Exodus 28 through 11. I want you to, if you have your Bibles, turn to Exodus 20, and let's just read some of the rules of Sabbath, okay? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. Sabbath means rest, okay? Literally to cease or to stop. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or female servant or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. So this is no work, okay? Now, what does no work mean? That's in Deuteronomy. We can go read that, but it's very similar. What does no work mean? Does no work mean, if I sweat, if I do something to the point of, I got to move some books today, and it made me sweat. Is that work? Is it so many steps that I take? Is it, how many letters can I write? How many letters can I not write? Those kind of things. What is do not work mean? And one of the things that we see here, one of the things that's going to be displayed here in John 5 is not the fact that Jesus asked him to get up to walk, but he has the authority to tell him to walk on the Sabbath and to pick up his pallet when the authority of the MISHNAH, the SHABBAT, has already, taken away right? Taken away the man's ability. I want to read here the Mishnah Shabbat 7:2. Now, this is, the oral tradition of the Jews at this time. And I want to read this passage. This is like their Bible, okay? They had 39 different categories, okay, that they divided all these works up into categories and then gave you parameters. So, here's one of them. Excuse me. The primary labors are 40 less 1. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, bleaching, hackling, dyeing, spinning, weaving, the making of 2 loops, weaving 2 threads, dividing 2 threads, tying and untying, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches, capturing a deer, slaughtering, flaying, or salting it, curing its hide, scraping it off its hair, cutting it up, writing 2 letters. You could write 1 letter, but you can't write 2 letters. Erasing in order to write 2 letters, meaning you would write 1 letter, erase the letter, and then write another in order to write 2, so you can't get around it. Building, tearing down, extinguishing, kindling, striking with a hammer, carrying out being anything, from one domain to another. These are the 40 primary labors less 1. Do you see how cumbersome and binding these are, and how weird some of those are? Like no tying of 2 threads, no dividing 2 threads so you can tie them back together, no stitching. Is that really what God had in mind for the Sabbath? And I feel like this is a life lesson for many Christians, okay? And I think what we're going to read here in Matthew 12 is a very good principle. I want to read Matthew 12 because I want to show Jesus is going to make a statement, not here in John 5, but in Matthew 12, about Jesus being the Lord of Sabbath, okay? And here's what he says. I'm going to start in verse 1. So let's go back here for a second. Let's go back a slide. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. Excuse me, I didn't sleep well last night. And his disciples became hungry and began to pick up heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath." And he said to them, Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, and he and his companions? He entered the house of God. They ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor those with him, for the priests alone. Have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break Sabbath and are innocent? So that's an interesting thing. There's 2 interesting things that he brings up. One is, David was on the run, and he was fearing for his life. Now, that's what the priest thought. Once again, we're not getting into that story. And the priest gave him showbread, which is normally not for anybody but the priest. It was a command that nobody was. But do you let a person starve with food that you have that only you're allowed to eat by God? But was that law made so that you could watch somebody starve to death who's right in front of you asking for food and shelter? And now there's 2 different interpretations of this. Some people believe that Jesus is saying, hey, you don't condemn what David and the priest did here, so why are you condemning me? And others think, myself included, that Jesus is actually saying what the priest did was okay, and that there are higher laws, meaning love, compassion, mercy outweigh other laws. Like, we are to normally worship on Sunday, but if I was driving on my way to worship and I witnessed a car accident and a person's lying on the side of the road and I don't stop to help them, but I use the excuse, well, I was on my way to worship and I let someone lay there and die, I'm going to be held to the higher standard of love, compassion, mercy, and that law overrides, in a sense, worship. It's not even overrides. It's, God would want you to do it, So it's one of those things that we understand in a very practical way, and the priests in the temple, by the way, worked on the Sabbath because they had to continue to light the lamps, and so they break it, so why aren't you all over them? And so they didn't really understand how to properly apply this. And verse 7 of Matthew 12 says, if you had known what it means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would have not condemned the innocent. And that's why I believe David and the priest were innocent there. Now, David probably wasn't innocent if you go read the story, but the priest innocent. And I desire compassion and not a sacrifice. So compassion outweighs, if you are to sacrifice and if you are to obey God, but you did it in, I'm trying to say, how am I trying to say this? And you did it in a way where you're trying to follow the law of God, but you have to pass over compassion. Like the example I gave this Sunday morning. It's just God desires the compassion over it. Now, that's not to say like new laws are created because of that. It's not to say every Sunday, well, now I'm going to go out instead of worshiping, I'm going to go out and just find people to help. This is one of those, it came along in the way. And so the same thing here. This man, he's on the Sabbath, he's picking up his bed. That was never a command by God. That was not one of the works that God made. That was one of the works that man made. That he was allowed to pick up his bed. He just was healed, and now he's going to go take his bed and, walk away from where he's lying and begging. And, so but their big deal here is not the miracle itself, but the authority behind him saying, get up and walk. And because the man will say, he who made me well was the one who said to me, pick up your pallet and walk. And they ask, who is this man? Who said to you, pick up your pallet and walk? Do you see? They're trying to discuss the authority. Who gives you the authority to do this? And the guy goes, I don't know. Jesus at this time did not reveal himself to the man, and later finds himself, reveals him, and the man went away to tell the Jews. I say Jew there, but the Jews, and tells them later. So there's this whole story going on, and it's setting us up for the next section, which we'll get into next week. But I want to end with this. There's something that Jesus says here in verse 14. Okay, John 5:14. Afterwards, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you. So this is very interesting. We've already shown back earlier that this illness, this lameness, seems to be something that happened to him at some time in his life. Jesus is indicating here. This is the indication that we're getting. This is where hermeneutics comes involved, where you have to go, what is Jesus implying? He says, stop sinning so nothing worse happens. He's implying that something that was less than worse happened because of sin. I believe Jesus is implying that this man's sin is what caused his lameness, which makes sense. I mean, you think about drunk driving. That's a sin. Drunk drive, you get injured. What caused you to be injured? Sin caused you to be injured. People who do dumb things, will cause injuries. And God has used sickness and illness and physical disabilities, throughout the entire Old Testament as a result of sin. So I don't think this is the John 9 case. Unlike in John 9, this man's sin seemed to be linked to his lameness. Sometimes naturally sickness does this, and sometimes it's an act of God. Meaning, if I go and I ride my bike or get drunk driving, naturally what happens is when I run into somebody or run into something, I'm going to be hurt. Sin caused it naturally. And there are some things that are God-given sicknesses or illnesses. Think about David's son for a moment that he had with Bathsheba. God put that sickness on that child, and it caused the child to die. That was a consequence of sin, but God enacted one. And so, so there are, just because, we want to use, bad things don't happen because you're sinful. No, not necessarily, but bad things can happen because you are sinful. And so this is one of the lessons that we learn here, is that, sin doesn't just separate us from God. It hurts our families, it hurts our friends, our own bodies, and so much more. I mean, where's this person's family at? Right? Where's this person, did he have a wife? Did he have kids? Did he have a mom, a dad, cousins, friends? Where are they? That he's now sitting here having to beg, where his family and apparently is not taking care of him. Did this sin cause something to a point where, his family left him? So there's a whole lot going on here. And it's something I kind of want us to end with, kind of practically, that sin is dangerous, sin is corrupt, it corrupts, it destroys, and it's not good. But okay, so there's your practicality for the day. This section, we're going to get in the next section, for this reason the Jews were persecuting Jesus. So we're going to look at the reason. We're going to look at all those things behind it. But I hope you have a great day, and hope to get to 16 through following next week.